Welcome to our Indigenous Allyship Research Series. In this series, we will review the results of 3 studies conducted by the Indigenous Organizations and Communities Research Lab at the University of Calgary. These modules were made possible with funding through Atapito, the University of Calgary's Indigenous Strategy, and its Office of Indigenous Engagement. In this module, we will take a hard look at the adoption of the term ally and why it is important to unpack what we mean when we use that term. In Module 2, we explore what allyship looks like from an Indigenous perspective, and in Module 3, we investigate what Indigenous faculty and staff thought about the results from Module 1 and what they are looking for in a job applicant when the work requires interactions with Indigenous populations and content and claims about an ally are being made. Allies are usually defined as members of a group or social position that affords access to influence or resources, and who acts in solidarity with a disadvantaged group. Allies have been shown to be a valuable contributor to challenge sexist and homophobic ideas and behaviors, and history is littered with advances championed by empathetic members of dominant groups. Allyship and being an ally to those who experience injustice, oppression, and harassment defends a moral position, and as such, the title ally comes with connotations of a righteous actor. In 2015, an awakening of allied consciousness for Indigenous peoples occurred in Canada. That year, the Canadian government-funded Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its report on Indigenous residential schools, detailing officially and comprehensively the government's and the church's role in a racist, ethnocentric, and intergenerationally damaging assimilationist policy. Unlike other events that raised awareness of Indigenous issues in the public consciousness, the report motivated political will across sectors through its 94 calls to action, effectively creating an incentive program to participate in reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. As a national agenda, every school, university, hospital, corporation, church, level of government, police department, courthouse, museum, media outlet, sports league, social work, and child welfare agency could get in on the action. Within our university, strategies were launched, policies were enacted, programs were designed, administrators and faculties were hired, and courses, curriculum, educational programs were created to promote reconciliation, decolonization, and indigenization on campus. As awareness of Indigenous issues grew, students started approaching me with questions about allyship. How can I be an ally? And how to avoid the pitfalls of posturing and superficial engagement? The question was deceptively simple. For every example of ally behavior I could think of, I could also recall an example of where that same behavior could go wrong. So we decided to research it. Our first study sought to understand how non-Indigenous people employ the term ally. More specifically, we wanted to know how non-Indigenous people rally around ideas about Indigenous peoples and acting in solidarity with them, and whether the term ally is used to signify the pro-Indigenous perspectives that we associate with the term. To investigate this, we utilized a method called Q methodology. Q methodology is a quasi-qualitative research method where people are clustered according to their shared beliefs, attitudes, intentions, behaviors, and experiences. The goal is to show how positions about a topic can be more complicated than just for or against something. The value of this method is that groups can be identified even if they simultaneously hold positive and negative attitudes, as long as there is enough people sharing those opinions. This is preferable to researchers deciding who belongs to one group or the other. This results in an organically defined snapshot of human organization around a topic. In the first step, we developed a Q set, which is a comprehensive list of all the possible ideas there are about a thing. Based on personal experience, a literature review, and contributions from Indigenous faculty around campus, we compiled 90 statements that reflected beliefs about Indigenous people and acting in solidarity with them. Statements included ideas that were conducive with allyship, like, I feel like it is my responsibility or moral obligation to act in solidarity with Indigenous communities, and I can use my settler privilege to act in solidarity with Indigenous communities. Emotional content, like, I feel sad when I hear about how Indigenous peoples are treated, and personal relationship items, such as, I've never really had an opportunity to spend time with an Indigenous person, or my personal contact with Indigenous persons has been meaningful. We included neutral ideas, like, I take a neutral stand during conversations between non-Indigenous people about Indigenous affairs, and ideas that were not conducive with allyship, like, I find myself being anxious while interacting with Indigenous persons, and I'm tired of hearing what Indigenous people want, or I wish Indigenous people could forget about the past and focus on the future. We also included positive yet condescending ideas, like it's a sign of respect that sports teams use Indigenous people as mascots, or I really like their costumes, they are so colorful. In the second step, we developed our P set, which is a group of people with diverse opinions. For this study, we recruited 90 non-Indigenous undergraduate students at our university through a diverse student sampling pool. They were awarded course credit for participation in our Q sort. After they signed up for our study, we arranged a time for them to sort our Q set on a pyramid that ordered items from those that were most characteristic of the participant to those that were the least characteristic of the participant. This activity was followed by an interview as to why they sorted the items the way they did. Upon completion, participants filled out a miniature questionnaire asking if we could contact them later about questions we had about their data and whether they considered themselves to be an ally to Indigenous peoples. Once the data collection was completed, we factor analyzed participants according to their rankings of our Q set. Interviews were used to help us interpret what the groups represented. The factor analysis identified 3 groups, which we named the supporters, the anxious invalidators, and the cavalier appreciators. The first group, the supporters, broke into 2 subgroups, which we further labeled passive supporters and active supporters. Passive supporters were associated with beliefs or items like feeling Indigenous languages and cultures to be important, that groups need to work together for reconciliation, and that the government has not lived up to its promises. Further, passive supporters reported being humbled at being welcomed into relationships with Indigenous people, but didn't have much contact with Indigenous individuals. Importantly, passive supporters didn't feel responsible or morally obligated to work towards reconciliation. The active supporter group also agreed that Indigenous languages and cultures are important, and that the Canadian government has not done enough for Indigenous peoples, but an important distinction between these individuals and the passive supporters was that they see themselves as agents of change. They were willing to learn about the history of settler-Indigenous relations, attend courses and workshops hosted by Indigenous scholars, sign petitions, listen to Indigenous voices on social media, risk losing their friendships and relationships with family to defend Indigenous perspectives. Moreover, they report meaningful and positive intergroup relationships with Indigenous persons and feel comfortable having Indigenous persons as their healthcare providers. The second group, the anxious invalidators, were associated with some pro-Indigenous beliefs. Familiarity with past abuses against Indigenous people, expressing appreciation for Indigenous cultures as a part of Canadian history, and feeling sad about the suffering of Indigenous peoples caused by settlers. However, they also endorsed negative or condescendingly positive stereotypes about Indigenous people, such as Indigenous people being drunks, lazy, violent, or liking their colorful costumes. This group reported having unpleasant interactions with Indigenous people, feeling anxious when Indigenous people were around, and having no interest in further contact. Moreover, this group thought Indigenous peoples are holding themselves back by focusing on the past, feeling annoyed or tired when Indigenous people talk about their needs or past grievances, and expressed no interest in risking relationships to call out racism, sign petitions, reposting information on social media, using their privilege to support reconciliation, paying attention to Indigenous voices, nor feeling a sense of responsibility or moral obligation for reconciliation. Interestingly, this group also believed equality can only be reached if we work together and believe Indigenous people would benefit from non-Indigenous people's help. Finally, the third group, the cavalier appreciators. They were associated with a mixture of positive and negative beliefs. For example, this group endorsed items like valuing relationships with Indigenous people, having an Indigenous person as their healthcare provider, and they rejected negative stereotypes about Indigenous people, such as violence and laziness, and felt comfortable during interactions with them. They also thought Indigenous people were kind, funny, and were interested in purchasing goods from Indigenous artists. Interestingly, they also grouped items with a different valence. For example, cavalier appreciators endorsed condescendingly positive beliefs like liking their costumes, considering mascots of Indigenous people as a sign of respect, and associate Indigenous people with nature. Moreover, this group took a neutral or passive stand when it came to advocacy, and felt that sufficient accommodations have already been made to address Indigenous people's grievances and that they should forget about the past. While the identification of these groups is interesting and testifies to the lived experiences of Indigenous people's encounters with non-Indigenous stakeholders, what is even more interesting is that rates at which individuals from each group considered themselves an ally. Perhaps unsurprisingly, 78% of the active supporters and 56% of the passive supporters considered themselves to be allies to Indigenous people. But 38% of the cavalier appreciators and 33% of the anxious invalidators also considered themselves to be allies. Our results show that non-Indigenous people cluster around very different sets of beliefs regarding Indigenous solidarity, but even more so that the term ally cannot be assumed to denote pro-Indigenous perspectives. These findings reveal the complexities of people's beliefs, and that self-identification as an ally does not guarantee shared perspective, experience, or agreement about how to move forward. If nothing else, our results justify the question, what do you mean by that? When someone says, I'm an ally. For more information about what's expected of an ally from an Indigenous perspective, please check out Modules 2 and 3 of our Indigenous Allyship Research Series. Special thanks to Elena Baliga and Miranda Harborn for their diligent work on these projects, and Haneek King and Max Moore for their work on these videos.